How does a forgotten political prisoner,
Hmm.
I mean, a guy literally rotting in an ancient dungeon without a trial, end up inventing modern macroeconomics?
It's wild to think about.
Right. He drafts a 15-year fiscal policy and basically saves an entire empire from total collapse.
Yeah, it sounds like the pitch for some geopolitical thriller, but it is actually one of the oldest recorded masterclasses in root cause analysis, and it happens in the darkest place imaginable.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are plunging into a very specific, deeply fascinating segment of the ancient story of Yusuf,
Mm,
or Joseph, as he's known in the Western tradition.
exactly.
And if your mind immediately jumps to, colorful coats, mystical dream interpretations, or some guy gazing into a crystal ball, you are going to want to reset your expectations entirely. Because the rigorous textual analysis we are unpacking today completely flips the script.
It really does. We are stripping away the romanticized mysticism here. What we are looking at is a hyper-rational systemic diagnosis of human psychology, bureaucratic failure, and statecraft. We're basically tracking a man's transition from a forgotten inmate into the chief macroeconomic consultant of the Egyptian empire.
So our mission today is to explore Yusuf's time in prison. We're going to look at the mechanics of resource management, the psychology of human subjugation, and this incredible concept the material calls a prison manifesto.
The prison manifesto, yeah, it completely redefines human dignity.
It really does. We will also explore why absolute personal credibility is like the ultimate functional requirement of leadership.
And before we dive into the deep end, a quick but important note to you listening. The text we are unpacking today wades into some heavily charged political and ideological territory,
Sure.
specifically regarding the legitimacy of human authority, state power, and divine law. Our goal here is strictly analytical.
Right, we're not taking sides.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting on the mechanics and arguments contained within this historical and textual analysis. We are not endorsing any specific political philosophy or religious worldview. We are simply your guides, mapping out the intellectual architecture of this ancient narrative.
Absolutely. We are just here to look at the blueprints. And, well, the blueprint starts in a cell. So imagine this scenario. The justice system has failed you entirely.
You're just gone.
Yeah, you are locked in a dungeon, in the dark. The natural human response is to count the cracks in the wall, beg the guards for scraps, or just mentally break.
Because that's what those places are designed to do.
Exactly. But instead, you sit there and draft the structural rescue plan for the very regime that buried you.
Which requires an astronomical level of intellectual and psychological resilience.
So let's establish how he gets there. Yusuf is unjustly imprisoned. He's the collateral damage of a massive scandal among the Egyptian political elite.
Specifically involving the governor's wife.
Right. And the authorities actually know he is innocent.
They do. It's an open secret.
But the demands of public relations, the need to protect the reputation of the powerful, they dictate that he be swept under the rug. He's a victim of arbitrary, unchecked human power. He is hidden away so the news cycle can move on.
And this environment, an ancient Egyptian dungeon, it is designed to strip away your humanity. It is designed to turn you into an animal fighting for survival.
Yeah.
Yet, Yusuf doesn't degrade. Two young men are eventually thrown into the same prison. One is the king's baker, the other is the king's cupbearer.
These are guys who were close to the absolute center of power.
Right, and now suddenly they are cast into the abyss, they are terrified,
Yeah.
and they gravitate toward Yusuf.
But they don't go to him because he's like advertising his services. They don't even know who he is.
No, they seek him out purely based on his observable character. The text we are analyzing uses a very specific term for him.
Osin. Yeah.
Muhsin. This translates to someone who is intrinsically virtuous, someone who maintains a life of balanced, beautiful conduct, regardless of external pressures. They observe him maintaining his dignity, his sharp intellect, and his compassion in a place that breeds cruelty. He is operating on a completely different psychological wavelength than anyone else in that prison.
I find that so compelling. Even in the dark, competence and character emit a kind of gravity.
That's a great way to put it.
So these two former palace insiders come to him because they have both experienced incredibly vivid, deeply disturbing dreams. They are panicked. And here is where Our analysis does something that completely caught me off guard.
It strips away the magic.
It totally strips away the magic. It frames their dreams through the lens of the unconscious mind.
Yeah, it uses essentially modern psychological frameworks to explain this ancient phenomenon. It posits that the unconscious mind acts as this massive, unorganized storehouse. During your waking hours, your conscious mind acts as a filter. It suppresses your underlying fears, your unfulfilled desires, your daily anxieties, just so that you can function in society.
Right, because if you were constantly processing your deepest existential dread while trying to bake bread for the king, you'd just collapse. The filter is entirely necessary.
But when you sleep, that conscious filter powers down, the suppression lifts. And all that stored, fragmented material, the fears of execution, the desire for freedom, the memory of a conversation from 3 weeks ago, it all begins to spill out into the theater of the mind.
You know, the analogy that immediately came to my mind when reading this is how a computer handles fragmented data.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about an old hard drive. Over time, as you save and delete files, pieces of data get scattered randomly across the physical disk. A piece of an image file is over here. A fragment of a text document is over there.
Right.
When you run a defragmentation program, the computer visually shuffles all these random blocks around to organize them.
That is an incredibly apt way to visualize it.
Because in a dream, your brain is essentially defragmenting the hard drive. Suddenly you are looking at a horse, and then the horse turns into an airplane, and then you are back in your childhood home eating an apple.
It makes zero narrative sense.
Exactly, because it isn't a narrative. It is just raw, fragmented data playing back as the brain tries to organize the residue of your waking life.
And that chaotic playback is exactly what the baker and the cupbearer are experiencing. Their dreams are a jumbled, disconnected amalgamation of their trauma, their professions, and their subconscious awareness of the political danger they are in.
Which leads to a massive question. If dreams are just psychological defragmentation, if they are just a random mixing of mental files, how on earth does Yusuf extract a precise, undeniable future outcome from them?
Right, it seems impossible.
Yeah. How do you look at random static and say, yes, here is a definitive map of what will happen to you next Tuesday?
Well, this is where we have to re-examine the concept of prophecy and knowledge in this context. When they ask Yusuf for an interpretation, he tells them, "The knowledge I have is taught to me by God."
Okay. Now, the traditional reflex is to view that as direct verbal dictation, like a voice from the heavens whispering the answer into his ear, bypassing his intellect entirely. But the analysis we are exploring makes a profound distinction regarding how that teaching functions.
Right. It argues that God teaches humanity by embedding potential.
Exactly. The linguistic patterns in the original text use the concept of God teaching to describe natural aptitudes. For example, it refers to God teaching the bee how to build a complex, geometrically perfect hive.
Right. A voice doesn't come from the sky to hand the bee a blueprint.
Precisely. Or God teaching humans how to use a pen to record history. The teaching is the embedding of instinct, potential, and deep structural intellect.
So when Yusuf claims his knowledge is taught by God, he isn't claiming to be a passive tape recorder.
No, not at all.
He is saying he has been endowed with an immense, finely tuned intellect. He has a terrifyingly sharp capacity for deep observation and an unparalleled understanding of human nature and societal cause and effect. He is a master of pattern recognition. He has been studying these two men. He knows the volatile political climate of the court they were exiled from. He understands their specific roles, the baker and the cupbearer, and how those roles intersect with the king's paranoia.
So he has all the variables.
Exactly. When they describe their jumbled dreams, his intellect filters out the chaotic noise. He sees the underlying reality of their situations. What looks like random defragmentation to them is, to Yusuf, a clear, predictable trajectory of state politics and human behavior.
I am picturing an elite detective. Everyone else walks into a room and just sees a messy, chaotic room. The detective walks in and sees a sequence of events.
Yes.
They see the exact trajectory of the conflict because they understand the physics of the environment.
Yeah.
Yusuf sees the physics of human nature.
And because he possesses this hyper-awareness, he also possesses a brilliant grasp of tactical psychology. He knows the meaning of their dreams almost immediately. But he doesn't just hand them the answer.
This detail is brilliant. These two guys are desperate. They are hanging on to their sanity by a thread, begging him to decode their future. And Yusuf basically says, "I have the answer, and I will give it to you before your next meal arrives."
He deliberately hits the pause button.
Why introduce a delay when you have the solution?
Because if he hands them the answer immediately, The transaction concludes.
Right.
They get their prophecy, their anxiety is either relieved or confirmed, and they stop paying attention to him. Yusuf realizes that right in this specific moment, he has something incredibly rare: total, undivided leverage.
Wow.
By delaying the answer, he heightens the anticipation. He creates a vacuum of suspense.
He is the ultimate cliffhanger. Like, I hold the key to your life or death, but we are going to wait until lunchtime. They are entirely captive. They can't leave the cell, and they can't think about anything else.
Their cognitive focus is entirely locked onto him, and what he chooses to do with that leveraged attention is astounding.
Yeah.
He doesn't complain about his unjust imprisonment. He doesn't ask them for a favor. He shifts the paradigm completely. He uses this window to deliver what our analysis terms the prison manifesto.
He pivots from their individual anxieties about the future to the structural root cause of why they were all sitting in a dungeon in the first place.
Well, let's dissect this manifesto, because this is where the narrative shifts from a story about surviving prison into a deeply radical political philosophy.
Absolutely. Yusuf begins by establishing his credentials, but he actively rejects any affiliation with the Egyptian hierarchy. He says, I do not follow the religion or the system of this society. I follow the path of my forefathers, Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub.
He draws an absolute uncrossable line in the sand. He is declaring, I am not a product of your corrupt infrastructure. I operate on a fundamentally different paradigm.
Right.
And there is a crucial linguistic detail here. The term used for his forefathers implies a continuous, unbroken chain of an ideological worldview. He's not just listing names. He is claiming a heritage of absolute, unyielding truth that predates and supersedes the current empire.
He builds this foundation of ultimate credibility, and then he drops the hammer. He looks at these two panicked servants of the king and asks them a question designed to shatter their entire worldview.
Yeah.
He asks, are many diverse lords better, or the one supreme God?
To understand the weight of that question, we have to look at how this analysis redefines our typical understanding of worship and polytheism.
Right, because usually when we hear polytheism, we imagine ancient people bowing down to statues made of stone, wood, or gold.
Exactly. We view worship as a strictly compartmentalized religious ritual, chanting in a temple, burning incense, offering a sacrifice.
Yeah, you picture a very contained, archaic religious ceremony that has absolutely nothing to do with how the roads are built or how the taxes are collected.
But the framework we are exploring completely deconstructs that separation. It argues that in this context, the concept of worship, or ibadah, is fundamentally about obedience and total submission to a supreme authority and its laws. Therefore, polytheism, or shirk, is not merely about bowing to a physical idol. It is the act of subjugating yourself to arbitrary human authorities.
So it's political.
Highly political. It is accepting another flawed, mortal human being, like a king, a pharaoh, or a dictator, as the ultimate, unquestionable rule maker over your existence.
I want to make sure I am grasping the full scale of this. Yusuf is looking at the baker and the cupbearer, and he is diagnosing their actual disease.
Yes.
He is effectively saying, you are sitting here trembling, thinking you were prisoners because the king had a bad day and threw you in a physical cell. But you were prisoners long before you ever saw the inside of this dungeon.
That's it, exactly.
You are prisoners because you have accepted a system where one human being has the arbitrary, unquestioned power to give you life or feed you to the birds based on a whim.
That is the exact diagnosis. He is identifying that their primary subjugation is mental and systemic. Bowing to another human being with surrendering your agency to the arbitrary dictates of a tyrant is the ultimate degradation of human dignity.
Which means that the concept of Tawheed, the belief in the absolute oneness of God, is not just a quiet theological meditation. In this framework, it is a radical declaration of human liberation.
Precisely. If there is only one absolute divine authority, then by definition, no human being has the legitimate right to subjugate another human being.
It completely levels the hierarchy.
It does. Acknowledging a singular, supreme, divine law frees you from the psychological and physical chains of bowing to a monarch. It levels the entire playing field. It asserts that every human being, from the prisoner to the pharaoh, is equally subject to an objective standard of justice.
I am struck by the sheer, almost terrifying bravery of this moment. Let's put ourselves in the room. Yusuf is sitting in a maximum security prison designed to break political dissidents.
Yeah.
He is whispering to the personal attendants of the absolute monarch. And his message is essentially, your king is a fraud. This entire political apparatus is illegitimate. You need to emancipate your minds from his authorities.
Incredible.
This is a treasonous political manifesto delivered in the belly of the beast. If a guard overhears this conversation, the punishment isn't just death. It is the most agonizing public execution imaginable.
It demonstrates that his conviction is absolute. He is not negotiating for an extra ration of water or a blanket. He is striking a blow at the very ideological foundation of the empire that imprisoned him. He's trying to wake them up to the reality that accepting arbitrary human rule is the core trauma of their existence.
So he delivers this profound, earth-shattering philosophical diagnosis. And then, as promised, the meal arrives.
Right, lunchtime.
And he gives them the interpretations they've been waiting for. And the brilliance of his pattern recognition yields a reality that is deeply unsettling.
It is a stark confrontation with the brutality of arbitrary justice. He informs the cupbearer that he will be exonerated, released, and returned to his position serving wine to the king.
But the baker.
But he looks at the booker and delivers a devastating truth. He will be found guilty and crucified.
And the analysis we are reviewing does not shy away from the horrific, visceral reality of what that meant in the ancient world. We often sanitize historical violence in our minds, but the reality of this punishment was designed to be maximum psychological and physical terror.
It is vital to understand the brutality of the system Yusuf was challenging. Crucifixion in this era was not a quick execution.
No.
It was a prolonged, agonizing public spectacle. The victim was nailed or bound to a wooden structure and left exposed to the blistering heat of the sun. They died excruciatingly slowly from a combination of asphyxiation, exposure, and severe dehydration.
It's awful.
The text includes the grim detail of birds descending to tear flesh from the victim's head while they were still alive but too weak to defend themselves.
It is stomach-turning, but it serves a vital purpose in our understanding of the narrative. This isn't a theoretical debate about political science in a university classroom.
Right.
This is a regime that hangs its own citizens out for the birds to eat simply to project power and instill terror. It is the raw, unmasked face of arbitrary tyranny.
The brutality perfectly underscores the necessity of Yusuf's manifesto. When human beings arrogate absolute, unquestionable power over other human beings, it inevitably descends into this kind of grotesque violence. The baker's impending execution is the physical manifestation of the systemic disease Yusuf just diagnosed.
So the timeline moves forward. The cupbearer is about to be released. And Yusuf, despite his towering intellect and his profound spiritual grounding, makes a very pragmatic, very human request.
He does.
He says to the cupbearer, "When you are released, when you are back in the halls of power, mention me to your lord." He is essentially saying, remind the king that the justice system buried an innocent man down here. Advocate for a retrial.
He attempts to utilize the existing bureaucratic channels. He seeks a middleman, someone with access to the inner circle who can bridge the gap between the dungeon and the throne room.
But the middleman fails. The cupbearer walks out into the sunlight, gets his comfortable, prestigious job back, and the trauma of the dungeon just evaporates from his mind.
He completely forgets about him. He completely forgets about the man who gave him clarity in his darkest hour. And Yusuf is left to languish in that cell for several more years.
It is a profound commentary on the nature of access and proximity to power. The system is entirely designed to ignore the marginalized. Those inside the palace walls rarely spend their political capital to advocate for those rotting in the dark, because doing so risks their own comfortable position.
Yeah, why rock the boat?
Exactly. Yusuf's reliance on a bureaucratic favor was always destined to fail. But the analysis points toward a beautiful, almost inevitable macroeconomic collision. The middleman failed, but the empire itself is hurtling toward an existential crisis.
And that crisis will require an intellect so specific and so aware that the system will be forced to bypass all its bureaucratic filters and march directly down into the dungeon.
That brings us to one of the most famous sequences in ancient literature, but viewed through a completely new lens. Several years pass. The empire is humming along, wealthy and complacent. Yusuf is still forgotten in the dark. And then the absolute monarch, the king himself, has a dream that shatters his psyche. Right. He calls together the entirety of his court apparatus, his senior advisors, his priests, the official state dream interpreters.
The whole cabinet.
Exactly. He details a vision of 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 lean cows and 7 green, thriving ears of corn alongside 7 dry, withered ones. He is deeply unsettled and demands an interpretation.
Now, these men he has gathered are the elite experts of their day. These are the highly compensated consultants who advise the throne. But when faced with this disturbing vision from the supreme ruler, their response is incredibly telling.
They dismiss it.
They do. They tell the king, this is just adgathu alam, which translates to confused, jumbled, meaningless dreams.
And this is where the analysis offers a scathing, brilliant critique of institutional bureaucracy and the psychology of the expert class. We have to examine why they give this specific answer. It is not necessarily because they lack all skill, but because they are operating under a system of extreme asymmetric risk.
Let's theorize on their position.
Yeah, I look at these court advisors, and it strikes me as the ultimate example of corporate self-preservation. They serve a king who, as we just discussed, literally crucifies people.
Yes, the states are ultimate.
If one of these advisors steps forward and makes a bold, specific prediction, say, my king, this means we're going to lose a massive war, or this means the agricultural sector is going to completely collapse, and they're wrong. They don't just lose their pension, they lose their head. The penalty for an incorrect forecast is death.
Exactly. The incentive structure of an autocracy breeds cowardice. If they offer a definitive interpretation, they assume massive personal risk. However, if they employ complex diplomatic language to say, this is fundamentally unknowable, it is just the confused wanderings of the mind, pay it no attention, they risk absolutely nothing.
It's brilliant in a twisted way.
They protect their prestigious positions, they collect their salaries, and they avoid the executioner's block. It is a non-answer disguised as professional wisdom.
They are the ultimate yes men. They either lack the rigorous intellectual capacity to decode the pattern, or they lack the moral courage to deliver a hard truth to power. So they choose the safest path. Institutional denial.
Which leaves a king profoundly unsatisfied. He knows intuitively that the dream holds weight. The failure of his entire bureaucratic apparatus creates a vacuum of competence. And nature abhors a vacuum.
This is where social physics kicks in.
Yes.
The cupbearer is standing there, pouring wine, watching the entire court fail to pacify the king. And the memory hits him. He remembers the dungeon. He remembers the man whose pattern recognition cut through his own chaotic nightmares with terrifying precision.
He finally remembers.
He speaks up, telling the king about Yusuf, and he refers to him as Siddiq, the absolute truthful one.
He recognizes that while the court is filled with men trying to protect their status, there is a man in a cell who operates on an entirely different plane of reality.
So the cupbearer rushes down to the prison. And this is where I really struggle with Yusuf's response from a purely strategic standpoint.
Oh, how so?
Well, if I am Yusuf, and the guy who abandoned me in a literal hole for years suddenly shows up, out of breath, saying, the king is terrified, the entire government is paralyzed, and we desperately need your specific genius to solve this puzzle. I am treating this as a high-stakes hostage negotiation.
You'd want to get paid.
I am saying, unlock the door, draw up a pardon, bring me a chest of gold, and guarantee my safe passage. Only then will I tell you what the cows mean. But Yusuf doesn't negotiate. He just hands over the solution. Why? Why give away your only leverage for free?
It is completely counterintuitive to our modern transactional mindset. We are conditioned to extract maximum personal value from every interaction. But the framework here suggests Yusuf is operating on a principle of absolute integrity. He understands what we might call the meritocracy of one.
A meritocracy of one. Explain how that functions here.
Yusuf doesn't need to hold the answer hostage, demanding petty concessions like a merchant haggling in a bazaar, because he understands the sheer, undeniable gravity of his own intellect. He knows that the analysis he is about to provide is so profound, so structurally sound, and so existentially critical to the survival of the state that the sheer weight of it will pull the king to him naturally.
It's a power move.
It is the ultimate power move. By freely offering a masterclass in macroeconomic forecasting, he instantly elevates himself above the petty squabbles and transactional politics of the Egyptian court. He proves, undeniably, that he is the most indispensable mind in the empire.
Okay, we need to do a deep dive into the actual analysis he provides because it is staggering. The court magicians looked at the fat and lean cows, the green and dry corn, and saw random noise. Yusuf looks at the exact same data and completely decodes it.
He strips away any mystical framing and presents a rigid, devastating 15-year macroeconomic cycle. He explains that the 7 fat cows and the 7 green ears represent 7 consecutive years of unprecedented agricultural surplus.
A massive boom.
The Nile will flood perfectly. The yields will be massive. But they will be immediately followed by the 7 lean cows and dry ears. 7 years of severe, catastrophic drought. A famine so deep it will consume every ounce of wealth generated during the boom years.
Wow.
And he concludes with a 15th year, a year where abundant rain returns and the society can begin to rebuild.
He drafts a 15-year economic forecast. But the genius is that he doesn't stop at the forecast. He doesn't just act as a siren warning of an impending crash. He immediately transitions from a forecaster into a policy architect. He dictates the specific protocols required to survive the crisis.
This is the demarcation between a mere prophet or fortune teller and a true statesman. He provides a highly specific, actionable policy directive. He mandates during the 7 years of abundant harvest, leave the excess grain in its ear.
When I read the agricultural analysis of this specific instruction, it blew my mind. We're talking about ancient supply chain logistics.
It is a masterstroke of ancient preservation technology. If you harvest wheat, thresh it immediately, and store the naked grain in massive centralized silos, it becomes incredibly vulnerable.
Right.
Over a span of 7 years, it will be decimated by moisture, rot, mold, and pests, like the grain weevil. These strategic reserves would literally turn to dust before the famine even hit its peak.
But by instructing them to leave it in the ear, he is utilizing the plant's own biological armor. The natural husk protects the endosperm. He is turning the biology of the crop into millions of microsilos.
Exactly.
It is the only way the grain could survive the duration required to outlast a 7-year drought. He is demonstrating an intimate understanding of agricultural science.
And he pairs this biological strategy with a draconian macroeconomic policy. He mandates strict consumption rules. He says, eat only a little of what you harvest, save the vast majority.
Okay.
And crucially, you must ensure that a specific portion of seed is kept completely segregated and untouched so that you have the capital to replant when the recovery year finally arrives.
We really need to pause and appreciate the scale of what he is proposing. It is the ultimate lesson in state surplus management. During an economic boom, especially an unprecedented 7-year boom, the natural human instinct is to consume.
Spend it all.
Yeah, an empire flush with wealth wants to build monuments, expand its military, and live lavishly. Yusuf is mandating enforced, strict austerity during the absolute peak of their prosperity.
He is instituting a massive forced savings rate on a national scale. It requires immense political discipline to tell a thriving, wealthy society that they must live as if they are starving, simply to prepare for a theoretical crash that is years away.
Think about how many modern economies, how many massive financial institutions collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis because they over-leveraged themselves during the good years.
Oh, absolutely.
They assumed the housing boom would last forever, and when the music stopped, the reserves were empty. Yusuf is essentially inventing counter-cyclical fiscal policy in a dungeon.
And when this comprehensive master plan is relayed to the king, the reaction is instantaneous. The king doesn't just hear a terrifying prediction. He hears a viable blueprint for his empire's survival.
He sees the way out.
And he realizes that the intellect capable of designing this blueprint is the only intellect capable of executing it. The king is astounded. He bypasses all his advisors and issues a direct royal decree. Bring him to me.
So the messenger sprints back down to the prison. He finds Yusuf and says, "Great news. The king has pardoned you. You are a free man. The door is open. You are going to the palace."
And this brings us to what might be the most shocking, counterintuitive twist in the entire narrative.
Yeah.
The messenger delivers the royal pardon, and Yusuf refuses to leave his cell.
It is a stunning moment of resistance. The absolute monarch summons him. The door to freedom is wide open, and he simply says no.
It really is.
I have to push back here because from a modern perspective, this borders on madness. We live in a culture obsessed with access. We network relentlessly to get a seat at the table.
Right, you hustle.
If the door to the executive suite opens, you run through it immediately. You don't ask questions. Why on earth would you choose to stay in a damp, dark, miserable dungeon when the king who controls the known world is inviting you to his court? Why stay behind to litigate a years-old political scandal?
Because Yusuf understands the mechanics of power and authority better than the king does. The analysis breaks down precisely why his refusal is the engine of his entire philosophy. It comes down to why absolute personal credibility is not just a moral luxury, but a functional, critical requirement for leadership, especially in a system attempting to align with divine, objective ethics.
Let's unpack the mechanics of a pardon.
A pardon, by its very legal definition, implies that a crime was committed. It means you are guilty, but the ruler, operating out of benevolence, pity, or political expediency, has chosen to forgive you and waive the punishment.
Right.
If Yusuf accepts the pardon, packs his things, and walks out of the prison, he is legally accepting the permanent label of a forgiven criminal.
He would be walking into the palace with a massive invisible asterisk next to his name. Like, here is the new advisor, who also happens to be a convicted felon that the king took pity on.
Now, overlay that compromised status with the colossal task he is about to undertake. Yusuf is not being hired to be a minor court poet. He is about to become the economic czar of Egypt during the worst existential crisis in its history.
There's a huge job.
He is going to have to walk up to the powerful elite, the wealthy landowners, and the vast agricultural workforce and say, I am confiscating the vast majority of your harvest. You are going to live on strict, enforced rations for the next 7 years while I stockpile the wealth of this nation.
And if the public or the elite view him as a pardoned criminal, a guy who got out of jail because he did a clever magic trick for the king and snagged a cushy job through a backroom deal, they're going to revolt. He'll have zero moral authority to enforce austerity.
Exactly. When the famine inevitably hits and the population is hungry and terrified, they will look at him and say, why are our children starving while this corrupt, pardoned convict controls the entire food supply?
The society would fracture.
His macroeconomic policy would fail entirely because it lacked the foundational infrastructure of public trust.
He is treating his own unblemished credibility as critical national infrastructure. He knows that without it, the silos mean nothing. The economic rescue plan collapses without moral authority.
Therefore, for his policies to hold the society together, he must enter the royal court not as a grateful subject receiving a favor, but as a dignified, objectively innocent man whose character is entirely unimpeachable. The system that wrongfully imprisoned him must be forced to officially, publicly clear his name.
So he tells the royal messenger, go back to your king and demand an official public inquiry into the women who cut their hands. Referring to the specific scandal that led to his imprisonment, he demands a full retrial before he will even consider stepping foot outside the cell.
He completely inverts the power dynamic of the empire. The absolute monarch commands him to attend, and the prisoner dictates terms. He forces the king to acknowledge that his own justice system is corrupt and that it buried an innocent man.
And amazingly, because the king is so desperate for Yusuf's intellect, he complies. He convenes the inquiry. He summons the women involved, including the powerful governor's wife who initiated the false accusation. The king questions them directly, and the truth finally comes out.
A break.
They confess that Yusuf was entirely innocent, that his conduct was flawless, and that they were entirely at fault.
There is a remarkably specific linguistic nuance highlighted in the text regarding this confession. When the governor's wife finally admits her guilt and Yusuf's innocence, the Arabic word Hash-hasa is used to describe the emergence of the truth.
Hash-hasa. What is the imagery behind that specific word?
The analysis likens it to the specific sound and movement of a bird landing. Imagine you are walking in a forest. You can hear a bird high up in the canopy rustling the leaves. You know it is there, but it is ambiguous, hidden in the shadows. But when that bird finally swoops down and lands on the ground right in front of you, the sudden fluttering sound of its wings, Hash-hasa, is crisp, distinct, and impossible to ignore. The ambiguity vanishes. The truth has landed, visible and audible to everyone.
The truth lands, and the entire court is forced to look at it. And this moment serves as a profound pivot point for a broader philosophical discussion. The text uses this confession to contrast relative ethics with absolute ethics.
This is a vital distinction. Most human societies operate on a framework of relative ethics. What is considered good or just or moral shifts constantly based on cultural convenience, majority opinion, or the dictates of whoever currently holds power.
It's fluid.
Very fluid. As an extreme example, there were ancient civilizations that genuinely believed human sacrifice was a good and moral act necessary to ensure the sun would rise or the crops would grow.
Right. If the king decrees it is good, the society adopts it as good. Morality is just a shadow cast by power.
But Yusuf's conduct throughout this entire ordeal represents adherence to absolute ethics. His absolute refusal to betray his master, the governor, even when heavily pressured and tempted by the governor's wife, did not stem from a desire to conform to Egyptian social norms.
Those norms were clearly corrupt.
Exactly. His conduct stemmed from a deeply rooted, unchangeable standard of divine ethics. He maintained his moral compass regardless of the consequences, regardless of who was watching, and regardless of the fact that it cost him years of his life in a dungeon.
And what is fascinating is how the governor's wife frames her confession. She doesn't just say, okay, you caught me. She engages in a profound moment of psychological self-reflection. The text introduces the concept of the nafsi amara.
Nafsi amara is a crucial psychological concept within this tradition. It refers to the primal, baser psychological self that constantly incites the individual toward immediate gratification, selfishness, ego preservation, or evil.
Interesting.
It is the internal voice demanding that its desires be fed, regardless of the ethical cost.
It sounds similar to the concept of the id in Freudian psychology, that raw, unmediated drive for pleasure and dominance.
It is a strong parallel. What is remarkable about the governor's wife in this moment is her radical accountability. In a society where the powerful constantly scapegoat the weak, which is exactly what they did to Yusuf, she refuses to deflect.
Wow.
She doesn't blame the devil, she doesn't blame the political climate, she doesn't claim she was misunderstood. She takes absolute responsibility. She openly acknowledges that her own nafsi amara drove her destructive actions, and she publicly affirms Yusuf's absolute purity and innocence.
It is a total systemic reset. The trial concludes. The truth has landed with absolute clarity. Yusuf's name is entirely officially cleared in the public record. He is no longer a pardoned criminal operating under a cloud of suspicion.
What?
He is an officially recognized victim of a corrupt justice system who has been proven unequivocally innocent.
And now, only now, does he walk out of the prison.
He walks out entirely on his own terms. Let's look at the totality of what he accomplished from inside that cell. He diagnosed the structural vulnerabilities of the empire's economy. He exposed the intellectual bankruptcy and cowardice of the court's expert advisors.
Yeah.
He delivered a manifesto that dismantled the ideological justification for tyranny. And he forced the supreme ruler to correct the corruption of his own justice system.
He achieved a complete transition from a forgotten, powerless prisoner into the most indispensable consultant and leader in the nation, armed with unparalleled intellectual and moral authority.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by looking at a text often dismissed as ancient mysticism, and we found a hyper-rational blueprint for survival. Yusuf didn't rely on magic tricks. He utilized a profound understanding of the unconscious mind.
He really did.
He leveraged a manifesto of human dignity that challenged the very nature of subjugation and arbitrary power. He deployed a genius-level grasp of macroeconomic forecasting and agricultural logistics to secure a nation's future against a catastrophic climate event.
And above all of that, his story is a testament to the power of an unshakable engine of reason. He prioritized his absolute, undeniable credibility over the immediate gratification of his own freedom.
Yeah.
He understood that true, lasting power does not derive from a royal decree or a fancy title. It derives from intellectual rigor, unyielding moral clarity, and the courage to demand justice before accepting a promotion.
Which brings us back to how we opened this deep dive. When you analyze these ancient texts through the correct lens, the muddy waters clear up. You don't see archaic myths. You see a hyper-detailed systemic breakdown of how human psychology, economics, and power structures actually function. The physics of human nature haven't changed.
They never do.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over today as you navigate your own life and career. In our modern, hyper-connected world, we are culturally obsessed with rapid advancement. We want to secure a seat at the table as quickly as possible, often compromising our leverage or our principles just to get in the room. But Yusuf's blueprint challenges you to ask yourself a very different, much harder question. If the door to power and success suddenly swung wide open for you today, and the system offered you everything you ever wanted, would you have the discipline, the deeply rooted principles, and the sheer courage to stay in your cell until the world was forced to respect you on your own terms?